Good afternoon. Welcome to our event. I'm Carol Bracken. I'm the Associate General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer for Tarrant County College District, and I'm so glad that all of you are able to join us for today's event. It's hosted by the Women's History Month District Committee and is sponsored by Dr. Stephanie Scroggins, who's the Dean of Human and Social Sciences at the Northeast Campus. We are privileged today to welcome our speaker, Linda Hirshman. She is a lawyer, cultural historian, and the author of Sisters-in-Law, How Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg Went to the Supreme Court and Changed the World. She is also the author of many other books. Sisters-in-Law was a New York Times and Washington Post bestseller and an NPR pick of the year for 2015. The stage adaptation of Sisters-in-Law premiered on April 3rd, 2019 at the Phoenix Theater. The 2017 ABC miniseries, When We Rise, was based in part on Linda's book, Victory, the Triumphant Gay Revolution. Linda received her JD from the University of Chicago Law School and her PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she has taught philosophy and women's studies at Brandeis University. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and Politico. She recently appeared on Season 2, Episode 7 of the hit Slate podcast, Slow Burn, to discuss the feminist response to the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. Prior to writing several best-selling books, Linda was an influential labor attorney. She brought three cases in front of the Supreme Court during the Berger era, including the landmark case Garcia versus San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority in 1985. She's argued cases in front of all 12 U.S. Courts of Appeals. She is currently working on her next book, The Color of Abolition, which will be about William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Maria Weston Chapman, and the miraculous success of the abolitionist movement. She divides her time between New York City and Phoenix, Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Linda to be our speaker today, and we have quite the treat in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and taking time out of what has to be really busy lives to talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor. Since you are all college students, I'm guessing that you know how to read, and accordingly, you probably do not need me to read to you. But if you would just bear with me for 1 minute, I would like to share with you a tiny bit of my deathless prose. By the time the nation celebrates the birth of its democracy each 4th of July, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court have mostly left town. But before departing the Capitol for their summer recess, they must first decide all the cases they have heard since their current term began the previous October. You will see this happen in a couple months for the current Supreme Court. The hardest, most controversial cases where the unelected court orders the society to change in a big way are often left to the end. As the days for decision tick away in late June, the tension in the courtroom is as thick and heavy as the hot Washington summer air. On the morning of June 26, 1996, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the second woman appointed to the High Court since its founding, slipped through the red velvet curtain behind the bench and took her seat at the end. 5 places along the majestic curved bench sat Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, since 1981, the first woman on the Supreme Court, or the FWATSIC, as she slyly called herself when she heard that the court called itself the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States. She named herself the FWATSIC. Each woman justice sported an ornamental white collar on her somber black robe, but otherwise there was no obvious link that bound the first and second women justices any more than any other members of the court. On that day, however, the public got a rare glimpse at the ties that bound the 2 most powerful women in the land. Speaking from the depths of the high-backed chair that towered over her tiny frame, Justice Ginsburg delivered the decision of the court in United States v. Virginia. From that morning in June 1996, Virginia's state-run Virginia Military Institute, which had trained young men since before the Civil War, would have to take females into its ranks. The Constitution of the United States, which required the equal protection of the laws for all persons, including women, demanded it. Few people listening knew that Ginsburg got to speak for the court that morning because her sister-in-law, O'Connor, had decided that she should. After the justices voted in conference, they meet in conference after a case is argued, and then they vote about how it should come out. And they voted in conference that women had to be admitted to the Virginia Military Institute. At that point, the Chief Justice, if he is in the majority, or the senior most justice who is in the majority, gets to assign the opinion. And he assigned it to the senior woman, Sandra Day O'Connor, but she would not take it. She knew, who had labored as a Supreme Court lawyer at the American Civil Liberties Union from 1970 to 1980, to get the court to call women equal. And now she thought the job was done. This should be Ruth's, she said, and so it was. It's a great story. It's a great story, but it's not me, it's them. Here's what they did. Sandra Day O'Connor grew up famously on a ranch in southeast Arizona with no electricity and no running water. One day, when she was 15, her father asked her to drive the ranch truck to the far edge of the sprawling cattle ranch in July and bring lunch to the ranch hands who were rounding up the cattle. Partway across the trackless ranch land, she got a flat tire. And since I'm talking to people in Texas, I don't need to tell you that getting a flat tire in the outback in July can cost you your life. She had to change the tire. She got the tire iron out, and she tried to take the lug nuts off and take the tire off and put the spare tire on. But they had been put on so tightly that this 15-year-old girl could not get them loose. So, as she later told the story, she attached the lug wrench to the lug nuts and jumped on it with the full force of all of her body weight until they loosened, and she took them off and took the tire off and put the spare tire on. But when she arrived at the roundup, she was late. "You're late," said her father, the famously understanding Harry Day. I had a flat tire, O'Connor said, young Sandra said. Well, he said, you should have started sooner. She learned an important lesson from that encounter, which was that when you're dealing with powerful men, there are no excuses. It would be a valuable lesson. Shortly after this episode, she was admitted to Stanford University. So, not being stupid, she's like, cattle ranch and no excuses father on the one hand, Stanford University on the other. Off she went to Palo Alto, California, where she met a charismatic mentor, Harry Rathbun. And Harry Rathbun's motivational lectures motivated O'Connor, Sandra Day as she was then, to go to law school, a very unusual decision for a woman in those years. She went to law school. Unsurprisingly, she immediately made law review. She met and married John O'Connor, a Stanford law student who was a year behind her. and they had 3 children. But when she graduated, one argues second or third in her class at Stanford Law School, she could not get a job at a law firm. The law firms were not hiring women. She and John O'Connor relocated to Phoenix, and she hung out a shingle at her own little neighborhood law firm in the Maryvale area of Phoenix, a kind of a working class area of Phoenix, and she did house closings and stuff like that. She wanted to practice law, whether they would hire her or not. She rose to become the vice chairman of the Maricopa County. Maricopa County is where Phoenix is located. So she became the vice chairman of the Maricopa County Republican Party Committee. And with those contacts, she got a job working for, through her political contacts, working for the local district attorney. When she walked into the district attorney's office, a state job, one of the all-male lawyers offered to help her out. But when I interviewed him many years later, he said everybody in the office quickly figured out that Sandra Day O'Connor did not need any help. Her big break came when the mayor of Phoenix, John Driggs, of blessed memory, decided that he would invite the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court to go on vacation with him. Now, this is not as crazy as it sounds, because the courts were having some kind of meeting in Flagstaff, Arizona that summer when the court's out of session. And so Warren Burger was going to be in the area anyway. So Mayor Driggs invited the Chief Justice to come on a houseboat trip, and the lakes, there are beautiful lakes in northern Arizona that are formed by the dams that form the various canyons. And he invited Warren Burger to come on a houseboat trip on Lake Powell, and then he realized he had absolutely nothing to say to the Chief Justice of the United States. So he invited the most interesting people he knew to come along and help him entertain Warren Burger, and that would be John and Sandra Day O'Connor. And the people on the houseboat noticed that after dinner, Justice Burger and Sandra Day O'Connor would disappear. Every evening they went looking for them one night and found them sitting in the remotest corner of the houseboat, chatting away like old friends. She always knew how to get along with powerful men. In 1980, right after the houseboat trip, Ronald Reagan was running for president, and he was worried that he wouldn't get enough votes from women to be elected. It was actually a very early appearance of the now gigantic gender gap between the Republicans and the Democrats. So he was worried. And he promised that the first vacancy that opened on the Supreme Court, he would appoint a woman. And we think Justice Burger weighed in heavily on the subject of his traveling companion, and he appointed Justice O'Connor to be the Fwatzek. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was born at the literally opposite end of the country, both geographically and culturally, in Brooklyn. In 1933, she went to PS 238 and then to James Madison High School in Brooklyn. Her father's family were immigrants. Her mother was a first-generation American. It was her grandparents on the mother's side that were immigrants. And when they got to America, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mother, Celia Amster Bader, that was, parents, having immigrated to the United States, decided that they had to educate their children, but they only had enough money to educate one. So they educated Ginsburg's uncle, her mother's brother. They sent the boy to college, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mother never got to go to college. It was really important to her that Ruth go to college. Celia Amster Bader never got to see Ruth go to college because she died the day that Ruth, her daughter, graduated from high school. And at that point, Ruth discovered that her mother had been saving money for her. so that she could go to Cornell with working and scholarships and the money that her mother had been saving to give her the chance that the mother never had. She too met an influential mentor at Cornell this time, who inspired her to become a lawyer. And she too met and married her husband, Martin Ginsburg. And they both went to Harvard Law School. When Marty was a year ahead of Ruth, so he graduated first and he went to New York to take a job with a big New York law firm. And Ruth, they had a baby girl, and Ruth wanted to keep the family together. So she asked Harvard if she could take her third year at Columbia. Having made law review at Harvard Law School, she thought they would be okay with that, but they said no. And she went to Columbia anyway, where she graduated first in her class. Even though she was first in her class at Columbia, and it was several years later, then when O'Connor couldn't get a job, she did not get the Supreme Court clerkship that would normally come with that kind of success. Indeed, she took a temporary academic job working for one of her professors at Columbia, and then she became an untenured entry-level assistant professor of law at Rutgers Law School. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's break point came in 1970 when the women students at Rutgers got wind of the fact that the lefty pinko girls at NYU Law School had a course on women in the law. So the women law students at Rutgers went to the two women professors that they had on the entire faculty at Rutgers and asked each of them if they would create a course in women in the law. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said yes. And the other faculty member is still teaching property someplace. Once Ginsburg went to the library and saw what the law did to women, she immediately reached out for her local ACLU to try to bring some cases to challenge the inequality of the law as it applied to women. At that very moment, the ACLU decided that women's rights was the civil rights movement of the 70s, and they were going to start a women's rights project. And they cast about for someone to run the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And when they saw Ruth Bader Ginsburg's writing, the contest was over. She became the head of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and she also got an offer to teach at her alma mater, Columbia Law School. In the 9 years that Ginsburg was at the ACLU Women's Rights Project from 1971 to 1980, she had 6 cases, 5 great wins, and 1 loss. In 1980, President Carter, who was starting to try to integrate more women and minorities into the federal judiciary, appointed her to the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit, which is often a feeder court for the Supreme Court. 13 years later, Bill Clinton was inaugurated, and he put Justice Ginsburg on the Supreme Court of the United States. So those are the facts. But hundreds of thousands of women went to college in the 1950s, and hundreds, if not thousands, went to law school. And they did not, as the book says, go to the Supreme Court and change the world. How did they do it? Here's how they did it. 1, they never believed the story of their own inferiority. It seems so simple and obvious, but it is in fact complicated and rare, and more rare among women. They did not suffer from the Cinderella syndrome. They never thought the clock would strike midnight and they would be revealed as imposters. They always thought they were entitled to rule. In 1993, right after Ruth went on the Supreme Court, another of her colleagues from Columbia, Harriet Rabb, was appointed the General Counsel of Health and Human Services, a big job. And Justice Ginsburg and Marty Ginsburg, who was the cook in the family, gave a party for her friend when she came to Washington. And Harriet Rabb walked up to Ruth when she walked into the party and said, "Do you believe this? The two of us in such high positions?" Why, certainly, Ruth answered. I have no trouble at all believing it. Believing they were entitled to rule, they treated their opponents and male colleagues as if they were all members of the same elite clubs. So when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was pressing hard for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which is still not passed, by the way, but we're still pressing for it, one of her law professor colleagues, Philip Kurland from the University of Chicago Law School, was trying very hard to defeat it. And he was succeeding, actually. I was lucky enough to have him for my constitutional law professor in those years, and I hated him very much. Ruth wrote to him, I am so sorry, she said, to see you used this way. How curious, she later wrote, to see such opinions from gentlemen of such extraordinary minds. Just us elite law professors here in the club, right? She kept her ability to judge them for just the kind of intellectual failing that they were using against the Equal Rights Amendment. When pressed to admit they were inferior, which as you can imagine was a little hard to make them do, they took offense. When Ruth arrived at Harvard Law School, the 7 or 9 women in her class out of the several hundred men were invited to attend a dinner at the home of Dean Erwin Griswold, the dean of the law school. And Dean Griswold asked each of the women in the entering class how they justified taking the place of a man. Starting right about the time of the women's movement, when Griswold's behavior, so cute in 1955, became, shall we say, not an advantage. Ruth began telling that story about the good dean. She told it so many times in the ensuing years that Dean Griswold finally sent a letter to the law school paper asserting he had only been kidding. Only kidding, right? We see that a lot, don't we? Once they took offense, as you can see, they held a grudge. Ginsburg didn't talk back to Dean Griswold when he was in power over her in 1955, but when the chance for payback came, she grabbed it. Early in O'Connor's tenure on the Supreme Court, Justice Brennan, a liberal, not famous for his equal treatment of women, by the way, a liberal justice who never had a woman law clerk until one of his pals told him he was going to get sued. Justice Brennan delivered an over-the-top, scathing, and personal dissent to one of O'Connor's opinions. She never said a word. Brennan's personal skills in the 9-person jurisdiction we call the Supreme Court were legendary. He could really work the halls. But he found to his surprise that she wasn't interested in being sweet-talked into making a majority for him when he needed one. He called that dissent the worst mistake he had ever made. When O'Connor was looking for a job her senior year at Stanford, she got an interview at the fancy national law firm Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, and the partner that she interviewed with told her that the only job he could offer her was as a legal secretary. Many years later, when O'Connor was on the Supreme Court, Gibson Dunn invited her to speak at the celebration of, I don't know, like their 25th anniversary of their founding. And she reminded them of the way that they had treated her when they had power, and she did not. She told David Letterman, she was often on the Letterman show, the late night male pundits loved Justice O'Connor, as all powerful men did. She told the story on the David Letterman show. She said that was the most fun television appearance she'd ever had. When they could not get even, they followed the advice Ginsburg got from her mother-in-law on her wedding day. Sometimes Martin Ginsburg's mother told his bride on her wedding day, "It pays to be a little deaf." And she gave Ruth Bader Ginsburg a pair of earplugs for a wedding gift. Sometimes it pays to be a little deaf. Unique as they were and extraordinary as this degree of self-discipline was, maybe most important of all, they did not think that when the goddess made them, the goddess broke the mold. When the women students at Rutgers came to Ginsburg and asked her to teach a course in women in the law, she understood the subject, women in the law, was not a novelty, but a chance to change the society for half its members. She always told the story of how she got her offer to move from modest Rutgers Law School to Columbia Law School because the Department of Education of the federal government was pounding on the schools to integrate their all-male faculties. Affirmative action? Maybe. They got Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Once ensconced at Columbia, she didn't decide that she was only there because she was the only smart person in the world. She developed courses and brought lawsuits to teach other people how to change the world. When Sandra Day O'Connor received the news that President Reagan had selected her for the Supreme Court of the United States to be the Fwatzek in 1981, she had but one concern. Why are you worried, Sandra? People asked her because she was rarely in doubt. It was okay to be the first, she answered, but she did not want to be the last. And so she wasn't. Barriers did not stop them. Mockery did not face them. When Ginsburg was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1993, someone sent her a letter telling her that one of her old law school classmates from Harvard had been talking about her at a meeting of his Rotary Club. Okay, now I want to set the scene. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is about to go to the Supreme Court of the United States, and her Harvard Law School classmate is talking to the Rotary Club, okay? So he told his fellow Rotarians that the guys in her law school class at Harvard used to call her by a nickname. They called her bitch. Ginsburg responded, looking back on her journey from the derisive Harvard Law School scene to the highest court in the land. Well, she said, better bitch than mouse. And now they are gone. I wish I could tell you that their years on the Supreme Court reshaped the world, but I'm afraid they did not. Sandra Day O'Connor was the critical centrist vote from 1987 to 2005, and her opinions left almost no legacy at all. She had no jurisprudence, she had no philosophy of law, but she had a perfect emotional quotient, an EQ, for where the American people were at any given moment. But wherever the American people were, the politics kept moving to the right. And the minute she took her hands off the wheel of being the critical fifth vote on the Supreme Court of the United States and retired in 2005, she was replaced by a justice substantially to her right. And in the ensuing years, the court, now with 5 conservative justices on it, systematically began dismantling the carefully crafted centrist opinions that she had generated for 18 years. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a legal philosophy. She had a clear idea of what the Constitution meant to her. And what the Constitution meant to her was that it was a document made for propertied white men in the 18th century. And then it gradually was an expanding circle of inclusion, first to white men without property, then to black men, then to women, and ultimately with the Voting Rights Act of blessed memory in the 1960s, meaningfully to black men and women. She sat on the court when the court expanded the inclusive circle of the Constitution to gay and lesbians in a pair of cases in the early 2000s. One striking down the Defense of Marriage Act and the other making same-sex marriage a constitutional right. That was her philosophy, but she almost never had the votes to make it real. As Justice William Brennan once said about the Supreme Court he led, the only question presented on the Supreme Court is, can you count to 5? There has not been a true liberal majority on the Supreme Court since 1969. When Ginsburg was winning her women's rights cases in the 1970s, she caught the tail end of the Warren Court in the 1970s, and she caught them unawares. It's very interesting if you read the documents, which I had to do to write the book. She asked them to make a small application of the Equal Protection Clause to women, and then she asked for a slightly bigger application, and then she asked for a lot of change. And by the time the conservative male justices figured out what she was up to in the late 1970s, before she went on the DC circuit, they were going like, we didn't want to vote this way. We would never have voted for women's equality in this big case if we had known. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg had tied them up with threads of precedent that she started building 10 years before. But it was the United States versus Virginia case that I started with was in many ways the high watermark for women. After O'Connor left in 2005, her legacy was mostly in the form of her dissents, her disagreements with the rulings of the conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Had Hillary Clinton been elected president, she would have been the senior justice of a liberal bloc for the first time in 1969. And she held on to her seat on the Supreme Court, waiting to see Hillary Clinton elected in 2016. It was a terrible mistake on her part. But I was her biographer in those years, and I said nothing, because what was the point? Now there is, in many cases, a 6-3 majority for unrolling what remains of her legacy. And I am sitting here with bated breath, waiting to see what the court will do. Will they strike down abortion rights? Will they cut back radically on the women's rights against sexual harassment? My liberal friends are arguing that the Democratic administration should expand the court and add more Democratic appointees, justices to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has not always been 9. It's been 6, it's been 10, it's been, this is not a fixed thing in the Constitution. The Congress can add justices, both at the Supreme Court level and at the level of the lower courts, if the Democrats can break the filibuster in the Senate. So, what is their legacy? Sandra Day O'Connor left a legacy of civility. She had a great emotional quotient. She was a great first. And she was a great believer in civic virtue, a legacy of civic virtue, learning about how the government works and being smart consumers of media. That's the Sandra Day O'Connor message. I'm not nice, so I actually don't think it's going to do any good. Ginsburg left a legacy of a political movement I call the notorious voters, right? She was the notorious RBG. And the weekend after she died, 40,000 people filed new registrations to vote at vote.org, a 68% increase over the prior weekend. So I would like to think that the young women that were so inspired by all the notorious RBG business are now registering to vote and going to knock on doors and organize. I think she would like nothing better. She was a movement activist at the ACLU. And before there was a print book and a documentary about the notorious RBG, there was a rap video that 2 political activists at the Global Justice Center, Kelly Cosby and Elizabeth Gavin, made. It was called RB Juicy, using the notorious B.I.G.'s song, Juicy. to tell the story of Ginsburg's life. R.B. Juicy, the rap video, is dedicated, quote, to all the judges that told me I'd never amount to nothing because of my gender, and all the women in the struggle. You know what I'm saying? And there is merch, little paper crowns, lacy collars, Halloween costumes, t-shirts. Justice Ginsburg knew exactly what a political movement looked like, and the notorious voters movement was her reason for hanging on in the last hard years. It's not over yet. If you feel low sometimes, I want to tell you, when the justice was feeling low, she confessed she would watch her copy of the rap video. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such an amazing talk for our Women's History Month. We have several questions in here, and I just wanted to kind of get started today about the reception of your book. How have men received your book? And this is a question from Teresa. With the rolling back of feminist legal revolution, it'd be interesting to know how men are receiving your book in terms of analyzing the correlation between the cultural mindset and that of the Supreme Court.
I have, many male friends in the pundit business, and they've been very supportive and very interested in the book because they're interested in the Supreme Court, because men are interested in where the power is concentrated. So when I give book talks, if it's not like for Women's History Month, just a regular bookstore book talk or at a law firm, the men come. And they, I noticed something early on in giving I wrote a book about how women went on the Supreme Court and changed the world for women. Hello. And I get these audiences that are part men and part women. And I have noticed that almost without exception, the first hand to go up in the question and answer period is a guy. And even though I'm so beaten down that I don't refuse to call on the first guy, when it's the second guy and the third guy, I always have to say, I'm not answering any more men's questions until I get a question from a woman in the audience. Because one of the things you learn when you're a professor or a teacher or a speaker is that you have control of the microphone. So, you can make it equal even if the women are still reading the memo about being Cinderella. In the here and now, I will say this about the here and now. The story has raced past where I left it off in 2015. A lot of things in America have changed in the last 6 years, newsflash. So there's a lot of our energy is now concentrated on breaking the filibuster and adding judges to the federal courts. That's really where the action is. The big lesson that people took from Ruth Bader Ginsburg's fatal error of hanging on too long, expecting the Democrats to win in 2016, is that Justice Breyer, the octogenarian Democratic man on the Supreme Court, should step down.
Yeah, okay. This is Dr. Karen Wisely, and we were kind of wondering, we did some discussion about your book the other day among some of us. How did you come to the decision to include both the first and the second women on the Supreme Court together in your book instead of focusing just on one or the other?
So I am a Hobbes scholar. This is like not so common knowledge. That's what I wrote my dissertation on in graduate school. I'm interested in how people are able to act together, right? So that's what interests me. And that's why I write about social movements. How do people overcome their individual weaknesses and selfishness to act collectively to make social change? And I knew the story about the VMI opinion, right? That was a story that was in the press. And I thought that it reflected the possibility that they had an interesting relationship and that their ability to work together would be a very good way of telling the story of the women's legal movement, okay? So Linda Greenhouse, the Supreme Court reporter for the New York Times, and I did a book talk together a couple of years ago, and she said no matter what Linda Hirshman says she's writing about, she's really writing about the movement. So I wanted to write about the women's legal movement. I thought it would be so interesting to see how these two so different, one Republican, one Democrat, Arizona, Brooklyn, how they managed to work together. And I knew they had worked together. And it actually turned out to be a really interesting story. They were not friends, okay? O'Connor was actually really close friends. She always knew how to get along with powerful white men, with Justice Powell, and then after Powell left the court, with Justice Breyer. But they were allies. And I think it's really important for women to learn how to be allies. You don't have to go out and go shoe shopping together at lunch. You don't even have to love each other. You have to see that each other's success is everyone's success. And I knew I had the glimmer of a story of that, and it turned out to be right. I love it when I turn out to.
Thank you for that. Why do you think RBG became so much more of a cultural figure when Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman on the Supreme Court?
Well, as one of my young friends said about her, she was so old and still so radical. And often the women of the first wave of feminism, because we had to take so much heat, to use a ladylike euphemism for what we had to take, get hardened and say, you know, we had to struggle, so you should have to struggle too. And they don't get more radical, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg remained as radical an advocate for women in her 80s as she was in her 40s. And so that was enormously inspirational to the next generation of women who made her this internet icon. And the second reason is winter was coming, okay? By 2015, was relative, by 2015, when they started with the notorious RBG stuff, it was relatively clear that winter was coming. Remember, the notorious RBG started as a story about Ruth dissenting from the 5-4 Supreme Court decision that struck down the Voting Rights Act. So winter was coming, and she represented to them some hope and a way of organizing radically politically again after feminism had seemed to be on its knees for so many years.
Yes. So what surprised you most about these women when you were researching them?
I think that what surprised me the most was that in 98% of the cases involving women's rights issues that came before the Supreme Court, when the two of them sat together, that is to say, from the time Ruth came on in 93 until Sandra left in 2005, in those 12 years, in 98% of the cases, they voted the same way. And remember, O'Connor was pretty conservative, and it was not at all clear for many years whether she would support Roe v. Wade, the abortion rights case. So it was interesting to me to see that they disagreed about many other things, but on that, when women were concerned, they voted the same way. The other thing that interested me the most was the warm, disciplined, and efficient way that they worked in alliance. So, for example, in conference, the justices, when they're trying to convince each other about how to decide a case they've just heard, the Chief Justice speaks first, and then the justices speak in order of seniority. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg noticed that when O'Connor was there, she would speak before Ginsburg, she was more senior. And Ginsburg didn't have to make the argument for women. But after O'Connor left, Ruth was, as she described it until Justice Sotomayor came, lonely.
That is such a touching thing to think about as well, that they, could disagree on so many things and yet really be allies. I love how you framed it through the concept of allyship. Another question said that they were interested in your opinion on the composition of the Supreme Court. Should the composition of the Supreme Court justices reflect the demographics of the country rather than the current party ideology? And do you think that there should be term limits on the Supreme Court justices?
It's possible that there should be term limits, and I say that because, and I think maybe there should be term limits on the United States Senate as well, because these institutions were created when people did not live so long. So we're getting senators and Supreme Court justices who are, well into their late 70s and 80s. And I find, just statistically, the odds of them being less competent intellectually go up. Okay, not to say anything about any particular senator that I'm thinking about, but so you're getting a population. So the nature of the human condition has changed. We're living a really, really long time. And I think that what happens is not only some of them are just as sharp as ever. I interviewed Justice Stevens. He was in his 90s for this book, and he was so sharp that at the end of the interview, I said to him, Justice Stevens, I wish you hadn't stepped down. But the odds of their losing their edge go up. The other thing is that radicalism thing that I was talking about before. I don't like that the women of my generation are saying to the younger women who are complaining about sexual harassment, we had to handle it and you should just handle it. I think they bring, I of course have gotten ever more radical as I've gotten older, but they bring statistically attitudes from their slice of life that might go back to the 50s or 60s that are simply not applicable 60 years later. So I'm not opposed to term limits. As to the question of the difference makes, Justice O'Connor said she thought that being a male justice or being a female justice made no difference. Justice Ginsburg thought that she was agnostic on the subject of whether being a woman justice made a difference, life experience, your demographic characteristics. Justice Sotomayor famously said that a wise Latina woman in the fullness of her experience might reach a different conclusion than a white man who has not had that experience. And I think we've seen that with Justice Sotomayor. She has brought the richness of her experience growing up in Puerto Rican family and community in New York City and the Bronx and being on the streets as a prosecutor. She's brought the richness of her experience to her decisions, and I think we've all been benefited by it. If you ask me whether I would rather have a justice who was green, like, Kermit the Frog, and of a conservative jurisprudence, or a white male justice who had Ruth Bader Ginsburg's jurisprudence, seeing the Constitution as an ever-expanding circle of inclusion, of course, I would prefer the more expansive jurisprudence. But I'm with Sotomayor. I think that your life experience does affect how you frame things.
Yeah, I don't really see how it couldn't, right? I mean,
Right. She's a living example of that. Her autobiography, one of the reasons I never wrote about her is it's impossible to write a better book about her than she wrote about herself. And that was a real contribution to our culture and to seeing people with her background as fully human.
I'll have to definitely read that.
Great book.
So can you talk a little bit about, we talked about RBG's, or you mentioned her dissent in that case, Shelby County case. Can you talk about any, were there any decisions that she made that maybe you think she shouldn't have, and particularly would you talk a little bit about O'Connor's decision in the 2000 election case?
Okay, so the decision that Ruth Bader Ginsburg made that she should not have made was the decision to stay on the Supreme Court of the United States as the 2014 elections loomed. The Democrats were going to lose control of the Senate, and the risk was way too great. It was narcissistic, selfish, and irresponsible. And so is Justice Breyer if he doesn't get off that court. That was the decision she made that I disagreed with. I cannot, to be truthful with you, think of a single other one. There are people who say that her decisions on criminal procedure were not great, especially when she sat on the DC Circuit and was clearly hungering for that seat on the Supreme Court. But it's not my area, so I can't speak to that. As to Justice O'Connor's decision in Bush v. Gore, it is possible that if they had allowed the votes to be counted, Bush would still have won. So I cannot lay on Justice O'Connor every bad thing that's happened since January of 2000, although it's tempting because many terrible things have happened since January of 2000. And I believe if the Voting Rights Act, remember what happened was O'Connor put Bush on the court, in the White House. She stepped down. Bush then replaced her with a bunch of conservative justices. Those conservative justices then struck down the effective provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and then, crippled by the Republican state legislatures' voter suppression, the Democrats lost the election in 2016. So they may have lost anyway, but because the Constitution is very much skewed toward conservative rural states. But I think that there's an argument to that effect, but you can't know. It was a very close election. The conservative revival, coupled with the structure of the United States Constitution, gives the Republicans a built-in advantage anyway.
Fascinating. So there's a question in here that says, through your own life experience and writing you've done, what is one piece of advice you would impart to women today?
Don't believe in your own inferiority. And I would say the greatest role model we have for women today is a woman who is not in public office at the moment, and that would be Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams was the minority leader of the Georgia state legislature and ran for governor and lost in an election that most people believe was stolen by voter suppression by her Republican opponent. She picked herself up, brushed herself off and got involved in the, by then well-established, voting rights organization in Georgia, knocked on doors, brought black voters to the polls that the white men who had been running Georgia since they pushed back Reconstruction in 1876 never dreamed would come. And there is a split United States Senate today, in my opinion, because of Stacey Abrams. Don't get the memo. You're not a loser because you lose. Look for where the cracks in power are and brush yourself off and go to work trying to break the system again. Stacey Abrams, that would be my advice.
Yeah, she is certainly a great role model for all women everywhere. As a last question, we want you to tell us about your next project, your next book.
Thank you. So I was interested in how white people and black people acted collectively to make the social movement we call abolition. In many ways, abolition is the most successful social movement in American history. It started with the modern abolition started with the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1831, and 32 years later, there was the Emancipation Proclamation. It was an astonishing accomplishment. So I found, I mean, everybody knows that the great figures of the abolition movement were William Lloyd Garrison, the founder and publisher of the Liberator newspaper, and Frederick Douglass, the most influential man in the 19th century. But I found a woman, Maria Weston Chapman, who actually was running the Abolition Society. You know, William Lloyd Garrison was her beard, but she was actually running the show. And so I'm writing about the three of them.
Well, thank you so much. We're definitely looking forward to the publication of that book and getting to learn more about those incredible figures. And what a great way to think about Women's History Month as we're kind of wrapping up this talk today about these hidden figures, about these sisters-in-law, about all of these women who made such a huge mark on society, and sometimes who we might not even be familiar with them, like the person you're working on now. Thank you so much for sharing about these two first women of the Supreme Court. And we would like to invite our students to fill out the form here. Yes, and there is going to be a copy of this book sent out to somebody who fills out our form today. So please make sure to do that. It is in the Q&A. And thank you again to Dean Stephanie Scroggins for sponsoring this event, the Women's History Month Committee for helping organize this, and for Dr. Wisely and the Northeast Campus for helping with the question and answer facilitation at the end. And thank you again to Dr. Linda Hirshman for coming and speaking to us today at Tarrant County College. We are so honored, and we would love to see you again, hopefully after we get your next book as well. So thank you everyone for attending, and one more time, fill out that form for attendance. Have a great day. Thank you.